It was the chill that woke me. My face and hands felt cold, even under the duvet. I blinked at the ceiling, groggy and disoriented. The alarm clock on the bedside table glowed faintly. It was just past 2 in the morning. I sat up, rubbing my arms, trying to shake off the cold. The house was silent. I could just make out the outlines of the wardrobe and the bedroom door in the dim light from the street lamp outside. The radiator should have been on, but the air in the room was icy. I got out of bed and reached for my dressing gown. As I stepped into the hallway, the chill deepened. Something felt different. The kind of different that makes your heart start to pick up its pace before you even understand why. I walked downstairs, my slippers quiet on the carpet. The lounge was darker than usual. The orange glow from the street lamp barely reached inside, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. The temperature was colder here. I glanced around, and that's when I saw it. The window was open. It wasn't open wide, just enough for a draft to seep through, but I knew it hadn't been like that when I went to bed. I kept my windows locked. Always. The curtain beside the window shifted slightly in the breeze, and I hesitated. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the open gap. My hand instinctively reached for the light switch, but I stopped myself. Something told me I didn't want to turn it on. I stepped closer to the window, intending to shut it. As I reached out, I heard it, faint breathing. It wasn't my own. It was soft, coming from the far corner of the room where the light from outside didn't reach. My hand froze midair, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't move, I barely even breathed, straining to listen. The sound was steady. It wasn't an animal, it was unmistakably human. My eyes darted towards the corner, trying to make out any shape in the darkness. The outline of the armchair was there, but beyond that, nothing was visible. The breathing didn't change, didn't falter, as though whoever or whatever was there didn't care that I was standing just a few feet away. I stepped back, careful not to make a sound. The torch was in the kitchen drawer. If I could just get to it. I turned, but as I did there was a soft creak behind me. The kind of sound wood makes under pressure. I froze, my stomach knotting, and turned my head slightly, trying to glimpse over my shoulder. The breathing had stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. My eyes flicked towards the stairs. I needed to get back up, lock the bedroom door, call someone. I took a step backwards, my foot brushing against the carpet, then another. My hands were trembling, and I clenched them to keep them steady. My eyes didn't leave the dark corner. As I reached the bottom step, a shadow shifted. Not much, just enough for the faint light to catch the edge of something. The outline of a figure sitting low to the ground, just beyond the armchair. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, slamming the bedroom door shut behind me. I shoved the chest of drawers in front of it, my breaths coming in sharp gasps. The cold was worse now, like it was seeping through the walls. I grabbed my phone, but the screen stayed black when I pressed the button. Dead. It had been fully charged before I went to bed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I needed to get out of the house, but that meant going back downstairs. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing, no sound, no breathing. The house was silent again, too silent. I backed away, my eyes on the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. My legs were stiff, my fingers numb. I didn't hear anything else that night. No footsteps, no movement, just the endless, suffocating quiet. When the sun finally rose, I moved the chest of drawers and cracked the door open. The hallway was empty. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The lounge was exactly as I'd left it. The window was shut, the curtain still, the corner by the armchair was empty. But there was something on the floor. A small, damp handprint, right where I'd heard the breathing. The light from the basement door spilled into the hallway, cutting through the darkness like a crack in a black canvas. It shouldn't have been on. I never used the basement much. A cluttered space full of cobwebs and boxes I hadn't touched since moving in. I always kept the light off and the door shut. I sat up in bed, the faint yellow glow visible from where I was. The air felt still, and I listened, straining for a sound. Nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Pulling on a jumper, I stepped out of the bedroom, my bare feet cold against the hardwood. I didn't like how bright the light was, how it crept across the walls and floor, a reminder of the basement below. The bulb wasn't automatic. Someone had to flip the switch for it to come on. The stairs creaked as I descended. Each step echoed, the sound traveling into the quiet of the house. The door to the basement was ajar, the light harsh against the wooden frame. I hesitated. The thought of going back to bed tugged at me, but I couldn't leave it. I crossed the hallway, opened the door fully, and peered down. The staircase disappeared into the light, the corners of the room below swallowed in brightness. I gripped the railing, descending slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The light didn't flicker, didn't dim. It was steady, unnerving in its clarity. The basement smelled of damp earth and cardboard. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, and old furniture leaned against each other in chaotic piles. The bulb hung from a wire in the center of the room, swaying slightly as though someone had just brushed past it. I scanned the space, my breathing shallow. The room was still, nothing out of place except for the gnawing sense that I wasn't alone. I turned to go, but as I reached the bottom step, I heard the faintest click. I froze, my pulse pounding in my throat. Slowly I climbed back up, gripping the railing to steady myself. My hand reached for the knob, twisting it. It didn't budge. I tried again, rattling the handle, but the door stayed locked. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind. The door had no key on this side, just a simple twist lock on the other. I pushed against it hard, but it held firm. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. There was a sound, soft, barely audible. A shuffle, maybe, or breathing. I stepped back, staring at the door, my mind racing. I hadn't locked it. There was no one else in the house, no one who should have been able to lock it. The basement light flickered. Once, twice, then it steadied again. I turned back to the room, scanning it again, looking for anything I'd missed. The boxes loomed, their contents hidden beneath years of dust and tape. The air was damp and cold, pressing against my skin. I searched through the boxes, pulling off lids, scattering their contents onto the floor. Nothing, just old photo albums, papers, broken appliances. I tried the door again, slamming my palm against it. My voice caught in my throat as I realized how thick the silence was. It was as though the walls swallowed sound, absorbing my panic. The light above me flickered again. This time it didn't steady. The room was plunged into darkness, the bulb above buzzing faintly as it failed. I stood still, gripping the edge of a nearby table, trying to orient myself. My chest heaved with shallow breaths as I felt the blackness around me close in. And then I heard it, a sound. Not the shuffle from before, not breathing. It was faint, but it was there, a scuff of something across the concrete floor. I backed into the corner of the room, feeling the cold wall press against my spine. I gripped the torch from my pocket and clicked it on. The beam swept across the room, illuminating boxes, furniture, and shadows that seemed to stretch too far. The sound came again, closer now, just beyond the edge of the light. I aimed the beam towards the sound. There was nothing. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy with something I couldn't name. I tightened my grip on the torch, refusing to let the light waver. The bulb above buzzed again, then flickered back to life. The room was empty. I turned towards the door, my hand trembling as I touched the knob one more time. This time it turned easily. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving the door wide open behind me. The light was still on, casting a harsh glow up the stairs. I didn't turn it off. The cabin had seemed perfect when I found it. Secluded, quiet, surrounded by a wall of trees that stretched for miles in every direction. It was just what I needed after everything. The estate agent had called it rustic, which I took to mean a bit rundown, but I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted somewhere no one could find me. The days were peaceful. I spent them unpacking the few belongings I brought, fixing little things around the cabin and reading by the fire. The woods were alive with sound during the day. Birds, squirrels, the rustling of leaves. It was the kind of noise that made you feel less alone, like the world was still moving around you. It was the nights that felt different. The first night I was lying in bed when I noticed the sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint scrape like a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was the wind. The windows were old and the glass panes rattled slightly in their frames. It was nothing to worry about. But the sound came back the next night, and the night after that. It wasn't constant, just sporadic enough to keep me awake, my heart beating faster than it should. By the end of the week, I'd convinced myself to investigate. It was broad daylight, and the woods seemed less intimidating then. I walked around the cabin looking for anything that could explain the sound. There were no branches close enough to the walls to make contact. The ground near the cabin was soft, with pine needles, undisturbed. No animal tracks, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. That night, the sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. I got out of bed and grabbed the torch I kept on the nightstand. My breath fogged the window as I peered outside, sweeping the beam of light across the yard. Nothing moved. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. The lock on the back door was scratched as if someone had been trying to force it open. A single footprint in the dirt outside the kitchen window, too big to be mine. The smell of cigarette smoke one morning, faint but distinct, even though I didn't smoke. I started locking every door and window before sunset, double-checking the bolts. I dragged a chair in front of the back door and wedged it under the handle. It didn't feel like enough. One night, I woke up to a sound that wasn't scraping. It was more like a thud, something hitting the outside wall. My stomach tightened as I reached for the torch again. The cabin was dark, the faint glow of the moon just enough to cast shapes in the room. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the trees. The next morning, I found the back door standing slightly open. The chair was still in place, but the lock had been forced. I didn't touch it, didn't even step outside. I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to steady my breathing. I spent the day packing a bag, my hands shaking as I shoved clothes and essentials into it. I didn't know where I'd go, but I knew I couldn't stay here. That night, I didn't bother going to bed. I sat in the living room with the bag by my side and the torch in my lap. The fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was cold. The sound came just after midnight. It wasn't a scrape or a thud this time. It was the creak of the front porch, the sound of someone stepping closer. I held my breath, gripping the torch so tightly my knuckles ached. The doorknob rattled, and then silence. I stayed where I was until the faint light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. Just the empty porch, the woods stretching out beyond it. But on the doormat, there was a single cigarette butt, still faintly warm to the touch. The knock came just as we were finishing dinner. It was firm and steady, cutting through the muffled noise of the telly playing in the lounge. We weren't expecting anyone, so it took a moment for us to react. My wife glanced at me, her fork paused in mid-air, and I wiped my hands on a napkin, getting up to check. The man standing outside the door was wearing a uniform, blue shirt, black cap, and holding a parcel. There was no logo on the shirt, no name badge, just a generic outfit that could have been for any courier company. Through the peephole I could see his face, pale and weathered, with a blank expression that didn't quite fit the role. I called out, asking who the package was for, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, holding the box, his eyes fixed on the door. I didn't like the look of him, so I didn't open it. I stepped back into the kitchen and told my wife it was nothing, just a delivery at the wrong address. She nodded and carried on eating, but I stayed on edge, my mind circling around the stranger outside. The knock came again, harder this time, almost like a shove against the door. My wife raised her eyebrows and I glanced back towards the hallway. The man was still there when I checked the peephole again, his posture unchanged. The parcel looked odd now too, wrapped in brown paper with no label or markings. I shouted through the door, telling him we hadn't ordered anything, but again, no response. He stood there for what felt like minutes, then, without a word or sound, turned and walked away down the front path. I locked the door and tried to shake it off. We finished dinner, cleaned up, and settled into the lounge. The evening crept on, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. Something about the whole thing felt off. I got up a few times to check the locks, making sure the front door and windows were secure. Around midnight, my wife had gone to bed and I was about to follow. I went to the window to close the curtains properly and glanced outside. He was there, standing just beyond the edge of our garden near the street lamp, the same uniform, the same blank expression, except this time he wasn't alone. There were two others with him, both dressed similarly, each holding a package. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the house. I turned off the light in the lounge and stood back from the window, my pulse quickening. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was some bizarre prank. Maybe they were trying to intimidate me for not taking the parcel. I crept upstairs and checked on my wife. She was asleep, her face peaceful against the pillow. I didn't want to wake her. Not yet. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and opened the curtain in our bedroom just a crack. They were still there, unmoving in the faint orange glow of the street lamp. I called the police. My voice was quieter than I intended. As I explained the situation, they said someone would be sent over, but it could take a while. I kept watching from the window, my breath fogging the glass. After what felt like an eternity, the figures started to move. Slowly, they crossed the street, heading back the way they'd come. The parcels were still in their hands, held close to their chests. When the police arrived, the men were gone. I told them everything, but there wasn't much they could do. No crime had been committed, and without a description of the vehicle they'd left in, there wasn't much to go on. They suggested I keep the doors locked and call again if they came back. The next day passed quietly. I went to work, trying to shake off the events of the night before. My wife told me she hadn't noticed anything strange, and I didn't press her. That evening, as I came up the driveway, I spotted something on the porch. It was the parcel, the same one the man had been holding. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. There was no weight to it, no markings, just the coarse brown paper and neat folds at the corners. I left it there and went inside, locking the door behind me. Later that night, I woke up to a sound outside the window. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to rouse me. I reached for my phone, but the battery was dead. My wife stirred beside me, but she didn't wake. I stood up and went to the window, peeking out through the curtain. They were back, all three of them standing in the same spot under the street lamp, except this time there were more of them. 5, maybe 6, each holding a parcel, their faces expressionless in the dim light. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring as one of them stepped forward, closer to the house. It was a small detail, something that shouldn't have meant anything at all. When I woke up and saw the front door unlocked, I felt a brief flicker of guilt. I must have forgotten to check it before going to bed. Oh, it was a stupid mistake, the kind you kick yourself over and promise not to repeat. I turned the lock, listening to the click. The flat was quiet, the dim morning light filtering through the curtains in the living room. My phone buzzed on the coffee table where I'd left it the night before, the only sound breaking the silence. The day passed like any other. Lectures, lunch with a friend, a few hours in the library. By the time I got home, it was dark. I turned on the lights as I walked through the flat, dropping my bag on the chair by the kitchen table. Everything looked as it should. A couple of days later, I noticed the missing spoon. It was one of a mismatch set, a cheap thing with a scratched handle. I didn't even like it much, but I remembered putting it in the sink the night before. Now it was gone. I checked the cupboards and drawers, thinking maybe I'd absent-mindedly put it away. Nothing. The next day, a hairbrush I kept on my desk wasn't there when I went looking for it. Again, I searched, pulling open drawers and looking under the bed. It turned up in the bathroom, resting on the edge of the sink. I didn't remember taking it there, but I figured I must have. Little things kept going missing. Pens, a pair of socks, a single earring. None of it seemed important enough to dwell on. I was busy with coursework, and the flat had always been cluttered. It was easy to lose track of things. Then the toothbrush appeared. It was standing upright in the mug on my bathroom counter. That might not sound strange, but I hadn't used it in months. The bristles were worn, the plastic slightly cracked. I'd replaced it weeks ago with a new one, yet there it was, as if it had been waiting for me. I tried not to think too much about it. I threw it away and locked the bathroom door that night, just in case. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of something falling in the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night it jolted me awake. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, listening for any other noise. The flat was silent. I stayed where I was, the duvet pulled up to my chest. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just something slipping off the counter, maybe a plate I hadn't stacked properly. I didn't go to check. When I woke up the next morning, a chair had been moved. It was subtle, just a little closer to the window than it had been the night before. But I noticed. Over the next few days, other things shifted. My keys, which I always left in the bowl by the door, ended up on the coffee table. A book I'd been reading disappeared from my bedside table and reappeared on the shelf. The fridge door was slightly ajar one morning, even though I knew I'd closed it the night before. It was the hairs that made me realize. Long, dark strands on the pillowcase of the spare bed in the small second bedroom. I hadn't been in there since I moved in, and my hair was short and light brown. My hands shook as I stripped the bed, stuffing the sheets into a bin bag and tying it shut. I locked the door to the second bedroom and slid a chair under the handle for good measure. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I kept the lamp on and the duvet clutched tightly around me, my ears straining for any sound. The next morning, I noticed the lock on the second bedroom door was scratched, as if someone had tried to force it open. I didn't go back to the flat that night. I stayed with a friend, telling her I needed a break from the stress of schoolwork. I didn't tell her the real reason. When I finally went back to the flat, I found the door unlocked. Inside, the place felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. I stepped inside, my hands gripping the strap of my bag tightly. Everything looked the same as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. In the kitchen, I found a single spoon resting on the counter. It was the one that had gone missing days ago. I didn't unpack. I didn't stay. I walked out, locking the door behind me, and haven't been back since. The power went out at 9:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through news updates while the telly buzzed in the background. 1 second, everything was normal. Streetlights shining through the curtains, the gentle hum of the fridge from the kitchen, and then all at once, silence. The room was plunged into darkness, and I was left holding my phone like an anchor. I clicked the power button, expecting the glow of the screen to cut through the black, but nothing happened. It was dead. I tried again, pressing harder, but still nothing. I stood up, stumbling slightly in the dark. My legs hit the coffee table, sending a sharp jolt through my shin, and I cursed under my breath. My hand found the edge of the sofa, then the wall, as I made my way toward the kitchen where I kept a box of matches. The city outside was eerily quiet. No headlights, no chatter, no distant sirens, just the muted sounds of a world without power. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't supposed to be this quiet, that there should still be some noise, some sign of life. After fumbling through a drawer, I found the matches and a half-used candle. The flame flickered to life, casting a weak yellow light across the room. The shadows stretched long against the walls, and for a moment I felt calmer. I took the candle back to the living room, setting it down on the coffee table. The light was enough to see by, but it didn't reach the corners of the room. Everything outside the small circle of light felt distant, like the dark was pressing in from every side. I went to the window, pulling back the curtains slightly to look out. The street was empty. The other houses on my road were dark, their windows like blank eyes staring back at me. I thought about the security system. Of course it would be offline. No power meant no cameras, no alarms. That's when I saw it. Movement, faint but unmistakable, near the hedge at the edge of my garden. My breath caught and I leaned closer to the glass, trying to make out what it was. A shape. A person. They were crouched low, barely more than a silhouette against the darker backdrop of the garden. I stood frozen, one hand on the curtain, watching as they moved toward the side of the house. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The candlelight seemed dimmer now, as if it wasn't enough to push back against the dark. My thoughts raced. Had I locked the back door, the windows? I went to the kitchen again, this time moving quicker, the small flame shaking in my hand. The back door was locked, but I tested it anyway, pulling on the handle to make sure. Then I checked the windows, running my hands over the latches to feel if they were secure. The sound came from the front of the house, a faint thud, followed by a creak. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to listen. Another sound, this one closer. I thought about going to the neighbors, about running out into the street and banging on their door, but the idea of stepping into the open made my skin crawl. I grabbed a knife from the counter, the metal cool and solid in my hand. The candlelight flickered and I turned back toward the living room. I moved quietly, every step feeling louder than it should. The room looked different now, the furniture warped by the shadows. Something shifted near the window. I froze, staring at the glass. The curtain was still drawn, but I could see a faint outline like someone pressed against it. The sound of breaking glass sent me stumbling backward. The candle tipped, and for a moment the flame danced wildly before dying out. I was plunged into darkness, my heart racing so hard it felt like it might burst. I gripped the knife tightly, my hand shaking. There was movement in the room now, the sound of footsteps across the floorboards. They weren't rushing, just steady, purposeful. The air felt wrong, heavy in a way I couldn't explain. My back hit the wall, and I pressed myself against it, gripping the knife like it was the only thing keeping me tethered. The sound stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't know if they were still in the room or if they'd moved on. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came in short, shallow gasps. My eyes strained against the dark, but I couldn't see anything, couldn't even tell where the furniture was anymore. There was a creak from the hallway. I knew I should move, should do something, but I felt paralyzed, my feet rooted to the spot. Another sound. Closer this time. The knife felt small and useless in my hand. The dark pressed in around me, and for a moment, I thought I could feel something just beyond my reach, something watching, waiting. Then all at once there was a sound louder than before, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. And then there was nothing. The day we moved into the house was bright and warm, the sort of day that makes you feel like everything is going right. It wasn't perfect. Some of the paint was peeling and the garden looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But to us, it was beautiful. The sort of house where you could imagine starting a family, where the rooms felt cozy even when they were empty. Hannah was already planning how we'd decorate while I was unloading boxes. It felt like ours the moment we stepped inside. The noises started not long after we moved in. At first, they were faint enough that I brushed them off. Houses make sounds, pipes groan, wood creaks, but these were different. Scratches, like tiny claws on hard surfaces. They came late, usually when the house was quiet and we were drifting off to sleep. Hannah thought it might be mice. I didn't argue, but something about the way it sounded didn't sit right with me. I tried to deal with it practically. I bought traps, even baited them with peanut butter, but nothing was ever caught. I checked the skirting boards for holes, thinking maybe they were getting in from outside. Everything looked solid. After a while, I started to notice other sounds, faint coughing like someone clearing their throat from far away, shuffling like fabric brushing against wood. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the walls, other times from beneath the floor. Hannah didn't seem too bothered. She said old houses made all sorts of strange noises. She joked that I was letting my imagination get the better of me, but I could tell she was sleeping worse. She'd toss and turn, and in the mornings her eyes would be dark and tired. I didn't say anything, but I started to dread the nights. One evening I stayed up late working in the lounge. The house was quiet, apart from the occasional groan of the wind outside. I'd left the lamp on low, the warm glow making the room feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. That's when I heard it, scratching, faint and intermittent. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling, it was beneath me, under the floorboards. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped. I sat there, straining to hear. Minutes passed and nothing happened. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, there was a dull thud, followed by more shuffling. This time it was unmistakable. My heart was pounding as I stood and crept towards the center of the room. The floorboards were old, scuffed from years of use, and the gaps between them were just wide enough to see darkness below. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the wood, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I didn't tell Hannah about it. I didn't want to worry her, or maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Instead, I tried to ignore it. But the noises got worse, louder, more frequent. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd hear them in the afternoons while I was in the kitchen or when we were watching TV in the lounge. Always the same, scratching, shuffling, coughing. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to check under the house. The crawl space was accessible from a small hatch at the back of the house near the garden. I waited until Hannah was out, then grabbed a torch and a pair of gloves. The air was damp and smelled of earth as I climbed down. The beam of the torch cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs and patches of dirt. It didn't take long to realize something was off. There were disturbances in the soil, as if someone had been moving around down there. Pieces of broken wood and scraps of fabric littered the ground. At the far end of the crawl space, near the corner of the house, I found it. A makeshift bed. Old blankets, flattened cardboard, and what looked like empty food wrappers. My stomach churned. Someone had been living under our house. I scrambled out of the crawl space, my chest heaving. My hands were shaking as I locked the hatch and ran back inside. I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. When Hannah came home, I didn't tell her. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Instead, I called the police. They came the next day, 2 officers who looked as skeptical as I felt. They searched the crawl space, the garden, even the attic, but they didn't find anyone. They said it was probably an old squatter who'd moved on when we moved in. They told us to keep an eye out and let them know if anything else happened. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The noises stopped. Hannah and I started sleeping better. I almost convinced myself it was over, until one night I woke up to the feeling of being watched. I lay there, my body stiff, my breath shallow. The room was dark, but the faint glow from the street lamp outside cast enough light to see the outline of the furniture. I didn't move, didn't turn my head, but out of the corner of my eye I saw it, a face, pale and gaunt, peering through the vent near the floor. By the time I sat up, it was gone. It began as a sudden jolt in the night, the kind that pulls you from a dreamless sleep into a world that feels colder, darker, and sharper than it should. I was in bed, the quiet of the house pressing against my ears. For a moment I thought it was just a nightmare I couldn't remember, some lingering sense of dread from my own mind. Then the knocking started, rapid, frantic thuds against the front door, the kind of sound that made my chest tighten immediately. I didn't live in the best area, but it wasn't the worst either. Late-night disturbances were rare enough to still feel alarming. For a long moment I didn't move. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. It kept going, each knock hammering into the silence, almost desperate. My eyes drifted to the small clock on the nightstand, 3:17 a.m. That time always feels strange, like the world isn't meant to be awake. My son, Danny, was sleeping in the next room, and the thought of him made my skin prickle. Who was outside? Why now? I swung my legs over the bed, the cold floor sending a shiver up my spine. The hallway felt long as I moved towards the staircase, every step quiet, deliberate. My heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. When I reached the bottom, I stopped and stood in the shadows of the hallway, peering towards the door. The porch light was on, but its glow was weak, barely illuminating the narrow window beside the door. I thought about calling the police, but something held me back. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe it was nothing. Still, I didn't go to the door. I stayed where I was, my breathing shallow. That's when the voice came. It was faint, muffled by the door, but it sounded young, a teenager maybe. They were calling for help, pleading. They said they needed me to open the door, that they were in trouble. The words didn't quite line up, though, as if they were jumbled or missing pieces. Something about it made my stomach twist. I didn't respond. I just stayed there, frozen, staring at the door as if it might burst open on its own. The knocking stopped then, sudden and complete. The silence that followed was worse. It felt stretched, unnatural. I held my breath, waiting for something more, but there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and started to creep back towards the stairs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Inside the house. They weren't loud, but they were distinct, the soft creak of the floorboards giving them away. I froze mid-step, my pulse roaring in my ears. My gaze darted towards the staircase, and for one terrible moment, I thought about Danny. The idea of something or someone heading upstairs made my throat tighten. I stayed rooted, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks. But the sound continued, moving slowly through the living room. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I backed up into the hallway, my bare feet pressing into the cold floor. The phone was in the kitchen, but it felt miles away. The footsteps paused and my chest clenched. Then they started again, heading towards the hallway where I stood. I couldn't see anything, there were no lights on, but I could feel a presence. My hands found the wall, searching for the light switch, but when I flicked it, nothing happened. The bulb must have burnt out. My breathing was shallow, every sound amplified. The footsteps were closer now, a soft creak just beyond the corner where the living room met the hall. I moved back, inching towards the stairs, my hands brushing the railing. I thought about Danny, sleeping upstairs, and my grip on the railing tightened. I wanted to call out for him, but I didn't dare. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to draw whatever was in the house closer to me. The silence dragged on, and I waited, each second feeling longer than the last. Then there was a shift, a sense of movement. I turned and bolted up the stairs, not caring if I made noise now. I reached Danny's room, throwing the door open and shutting it behind me. He was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. I pressed my back against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened, straining to catch any sound from downstairs. Nothing. The quiet was almost suffocating. I stood there, every muscle tense for what felt like hours. The house felt wrong, as if something had seeped into its walls, into the very air. I didn't dare open the door, didn't dare look. I didn't move until the faint light of dawn began creeping through the window, softening the edges of the dark. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The house was still. I checked every room, every corner, but there was no one there. The front door was locked. Nothing was out of place. Danny didn't remember anything unusual, but I did.